I grew up in a farmhouse outside Council Bluffs, Iowa, the second of three children, with a father who ran the county's largest grain elevator and a mother, Margaret Whitfield, who was, for the first 41 years of her life, the single steadiest presence any of us had ever known. She taught Sunday school at First Lutheran for a decade. She canned tomatoes every August with a specific, methodical patience that made the whole kitchen smell like summer well into November. She was the kind of mother other kids in the neighborhood gravitated toward, not because she spoiled anyone, but because she had a way of making you feel entirely seen the moment she looked at you, a quality I did not fully appreciate until I spent the rest of my life meeting people who didn't have it. Our farmhouse sat on 11 acres at the end of a gravel road, close enough to town that my father's commute to the grain elevator took less than 15 minutes, far enough out that on clear nights you could see more stars than most people I've met since have ever seen in their lives. My mother ran that house with a specific, orderly warmth that I only came to fully understand as remarkable once I'd lived long enough to see how many other houses lacked it. Dinner on the table every evening at 6. A specific chore chart taped inside the pantry door that she updated every Sunday. A garden she tended herself through every summer that fed most of our family's vegetables from May through October. She had grown up on a farm herself, 2 counties over, the third of 5 children, and she used to say that the specific discipline of farm life had taught her everything she knew about taking care of people, that you learned, growing up that way, exactly how much attention a living thing needed to actually thrive. And she brought that same attentiveness to raising the 3 of us with a consistency I didn't fully appreciate until much later. My relationship with my mother specifically had a particular closeness that I think surprised even her, given that I was her only son sandwiched between 2 daughters, my older sister Patricia and my younger sister Ellen. She used to call me her steady one, the child she didn't have to worry about in the specific way she occasionally worried about my sister's more volatile moods. And I think, looking back, that steadiness was less an inherent quality of mine than a role I'd absorbed from watching her, the way children absorb the emotional architecture of the parent they're closest to without ever quite realizing they're doing it. I want to be clear, before I tell you what happened to her, that I do not use the word possessed lightly, and I did not arrive at it quickly. I want you to understand that for the better part of a year, my father exhausted every ordinary explanation before either of us reached for anything else. We are not, and we're not, a family inclined towards superstition. My father was a practical man who fixed his own combines and distrusted anything he couldn't put his hands on. What I'm going to tell you is simply what happened, in the order it happened, and I will let you decide what to call it. It began, as far as any of us could later reconstruct, in the autumn of 1979, the year I turned 14, not long after my mother's younger brother, my Uncle Roy, died in a grain bin accident on the family farm 2 counties over. My mother had been close to Roy in the specific, uncomplicated way siblings sometimes manage when the rest of a family is complicated around them, and his death hit her harder than any of us, including my father, fully anticipated. She did not talk about it much in the weeks that followed, which we all took at the time, for the ordinary reticence of grief in a household that did not have much language for large feelings. Looking back, I think that silence was the first sign of something, though none of us had any way of knowing it yet. Roy had been the youngest of the 5 siblings in my mother's family, 7 years her junior, and I think, in a household of 5 children where the older siblings had scattered by the time Roy was still young, my mother had ended up occupying something closer to a second mother's role in his childhood than an ordinary sister's, a closeness that carried forward, unchanged, into their adult lives. He visited our farm often, brought my mother the specific kind of easy, unguarded laughter she didn't show as freely with anyone else in the family. And I remember, as a boy, watching the two of them together and understanding, in the wordless way children understand things, that whatever existed between them ran considerably deeper than the ordinary affection between siblings. His death was sudden, and by every account I've since read about grain bin accidents, was over within minutes in a way that offered no warning and no chance for anyone to intervene. A specific, brutal randomness that I think made it harder for my mother to process than a longer illness might have been. There was no chance to say anything, no final conversation to hold onto, only an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that ended, without any warning at all, with the person she'd been closest to in her entire family suddenly and permanently gone. The funeral was the largest our small church had seen in years, and I remember my mother standing at the front of it in a state of controlled, dry-eyed composure that worried my father more. He told me years later, than open weeping would have, because he'd never seen her hold something that large so tightly, so silently, without any visible release. I remember specific details from that funeral with a clarity that surprises me even now, 46 years later. The particular gray November light coming through the church's stained glass windows, the smell of too many casseroles crowded onto the fellowship hall's folding tables afterward, my mother standing at the receiving line for nearly 2 hours accepting condolences with the same fixed, careful composure she'd maintained through the service itself. Never once, that entire day, allowing herself the release my father told me, years later, he'd almost been hoping for on her behalf. I remember my own confusion, at 14, watching my mother hold herself together so completely while grown men around us, including 2 of Roy's old farming friends, wept openly. And I remember thinking, with the specific limited understanding of a 14-year-old, that my mother was simply being strong, not yet having any framework for understanding that some kinds of strength come at a cost that reveals itself only much later. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. The specific incident that I now understand, decades later, as the actual beginning happened on a Friday evening in early November, 3 weeks after Roy's funeral. My mother's oldest friend, a woman named Carol Ann Prout, had organized what she called a small gathering at her house. A handful of women from the church, ostensibly to comfort my mother in her grief, though I learned much later from my aunt that the evening had included something considerably stranger than casseroles and quiet conversation. Carol Ann, it turned out, had recently become interested, through a cousin in Omaha, in a particular kind of grief practice that involved trying to reach the recently departed, and she had convinced several of the women that evening, my mother included, still raw and desperate in the specific way grief makes people desperate, to participate in something she promised would let my mother say the goodbye to Roy that his sudden accident hadn't allowed. My Aunt Dolores, my mother's older sister, was among the women present that evening, and she was the one who eventually told me, years later, at a family gathering long after my mother's death, the fuller shape of what she remembered. She described a living room lit only by candles, 6 women seated in a loose circle, Carol Ann leading something she'd learned secondhand and imperfectly from her Omaha cousin, treating the whole thing, at least at first, with the slightly nervous, half-serious energy of women trying something unfamiliar together, more curious than genuinely convinced anything real was going to happen. My aunt told me the mood in that room shifted, and shifted quickly. Somewhere around the 3rd time they said my Uncle Roy's name aloud together, a change she described as a specific, sudden drop in temperature that everyone in the room noticed at once, followed by my mother going rigid in her chair, her breathing shallow and strange, her eyes open but, in my aunt's words, not looking at anything in that room anymore. I do not know the exact details of what happened that evening, because my mother never fully described it to me, and the women who were present have, in the decades since, been reluctant to discuss it in any detail beyond confirming that something happened, that my mother had what Carol Ann later called a bad turn, going pale and cold to the touch for several minutes, in a way that frightened everyone in the room badly enough that the gathering ended abruptly, with two of the women driving my mother home early, still shaken, unable to fully explain what they'd witnessed. My aunt told me that by the time they got my mother into the car, she seemed to have returned to herself, tired and disoriented but recognizably my mother, apologizing for having frightened everyone, attributing it herself in the moment to exhaustion and grief, and having eaten too little that day. Nobody in that car, my aunt included, imagined they were driving home a woman who had changed, that night, in some way none of them yet had any language for. My mother was different when she came home that night. Not dramatically, not in any way my father registered as more than an unusually bad night following an unusually difficult evening for a grieving woman. But I was 14, and I was still awake, and I remember standing in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom door, having gotten up for water, and hearing my mother's voice through the door, low and strange, saying something to my father that I couldn't make out, followed by a silence that went on long enough that I eventually went back to bed, telling myself it was nothing, the way children tell themselves that about most things they don't understand. The changes over the following months were gradual enough that each individual one seemed explainable on its own terms, and it was only much later, laying them all out in sequence, that my father and I understood how completely they had reshaped the woman we lived with. She stopped attending Sunday school by December, which my father attributed to lingering grief over Roy. She began sleeping unusual hours, sometimes not at all through the night, which the family doctor attributed, when my father finally mentioned it at a checkup in January, to a grief-related sleep disturbance that would likely resolve with time. She grew thinner through the winter, in a way that worried my father enough to bring it up twice more with the doctor, who ran routine blood work that came back, each time, entirely unremarkable. The garden, too, became something I noticed slipping, in a way that felt small at the time and significant only in retrospect. My mother had always started her seed trays on the kitchen windowsill in early February, a ritual as fixed in our household calendar as Christmas or the 4th of July, and that February, for the first time in my life, the windowsill stayed empty. When I finally asked her about it, sometime in mid-February, she looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read and said only, "There won't be a garden this year, Tommy," in a flat, final tone that discouraged any follow-up question. And I remember feeling, even at 14, a specific unease at hearing my mother close off a conversation in a way she never had before, my whole life, about anything. My older sister, Patricia, who was 16 that winter and had her own busy life of school and a part-time job at the pharmacy in town, noticed the changes more gradually than Ellen and I did, if only because she was home less often to witness them accumulate. But she told me, decades later, comparing notes as adults trying to reconstruct that year, that she remembered a specific evening in January when she'd come home late from a shift and found our mother sitting alone in the darkened living room, not reading, not doing anything, simply sitting. And when Patricia asked if she was okay, our mother had turned to look at her and said, in a voice Patricia described as sounding almost apologetic, "I'm trying to stay quiet enough that it doesn't notice I'm still here." a sentence that made no sense to Patricia at 16, that she filed away as one more strange, grief-fogged thing. Their mother had said that winter, not understanding, until years later, piecing it together with everything else, what our mother might actually have been describing. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think, and we're nowhere near the end of this one. What I remember most clearly from that winter, more than any single dramatic incident, is the specific, accumulating wrongness of my mother's eyes. I don't know how else to describe it in a way that will make sense to someone who wasn't there. My mother had warm brown eyes her whole life, the kind of eyes people used to say lit up a room, and sometime that winter, without any single moment I could point to as the change, they stopped doing that. They became, instead, a kind of flat, watching stillness that I would catch sometimes across the dinner table, her looking at my younger sister Ellen or at me with an expression that had none of the specific warmth I associated with being looked at by my mother, replaced by something closer to careful, patient observation, the way you might watch an animal whose behavior you were trying to predict. I remember trying more than once that winter to describe this specific change to my father, and failing every time to find language adequate to it. Her eyes looked different, I told him once, at maybe 15 years old, unable to elaborate any further than that. And I remember him looking at me with the particular patient dismissiveness of a man who understood his son was frightened and grieving alongside the rest of the family, and who attributed my observation to exactly that, rather than to anything he was prepared, at that point in the winter, to take as seriously as it deserved. It would be months before he stopped being able to explain away what the rest of us were noticing, and I think, looking back, that this gap, the space between what Patricia, Ellen, and I were each independently sensing and what my father was willing to fully acknowledge, was its own quiet, difficult burden that winter, 3 children carrying a fear their father wasn't yet ready to validate. My sister Ellen, who was 9 that winter, was the first of us to say the word frightened out loud. She came to my room on a night in February, unable to sleep, and told me she didn't want to be alone in the house with Mom anymore. And when I asked her why, she couldn't fully articulate it beyond saying that Mom looked at her wrong sometimes, that Mom had started humming a tune under her breath that Ellen didn't recognize and found upsetting in a way she couldn't explain, low and tuneless and constant, the kind of thing you'd normally tune out except that it never seemed to. Even when my mother was doing ordinary things, washing dishes, folding laundry, sitting in church, my father held out longest against any explanation beyond grief and stress, which I understand now, as an adult, was not stubbornness so much as the specific, desperate optimism of a man who could not afford, emotionally, to consider the alternative. It was an incident in March, though, that finally cracked that optimism in a way none of us could talk our way around afterward. My father had come home late from the grain elevator, later than usual, to find my mother standing in the unlit kitchen in the dark, not doing anything, simply standing, facing the window that looked out over the empty winter fields. And when he turned on the light and asked her what she was doing, she turned to look at him with an expression he described to me, years later, the only time he ever fully described that night to me, as containing absolutely nothing he recognized as. "Ellen," she said, though he had asked no question involving Ellen, "you should check on Ellen." My father, alarmed by the strangeness of the response, went upstairs immediately and found my sister sleeping soundly, entirely fine, nothing wrong at all, except that when he came back downstairs to tell my mother everything was okay, she was gone from the kitchen, and he found her instead standing at the top of the basement stairs in the dark, apparently having climbed both flights of stairs in the roughly 90 seconds he'd been checking on Ellen, though the basement door. When he checked it the following morning, had been locked from the inside the entire time, in a way that made no physical sense for a woman he just watched walk down a hallway. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. My father took her to see Dr. Hollis Burgeon, the family physician who had delivered all three of us, the following week, describing as much of what had been happening as he could bring himself to say out loud in a small-town doctor's office in 1980, a year and a place with very little vocabulary available for what our family was actually experiencing. Dr. Burgeon, to his credit, took my father seriously, ran an extensive battery of tests, referred my mother to a psychiatrist in Omaha for an evaluation that took most of a difficult, exhausting day, and came back in the end with a diagnosis that satisfied absolutely no one: a severe grief-related depressive episode, possibly complicated by an emerging psychiatric condition the psychiatrist wasn't yet prepared to name definitively, requiring closer monitoring. When my mother actually took it, which was inconsistent at best, seemed to do nothing at all to touch whatever was actually happening to her. The trip to Omaha for that psychiatric evaluation is one of the few memories from that period I have almost entirely secondhand, because I stayed home with Ellen while my father drove my mother the 90 minutes to the specialist's office. But my father described it to me once years later, in more detail than he usually allowed himself when discussing that year. He told me the psychiatrist, a careful, methodical man named Dr. Ansel Reyes, had spent nearly 6 hours with my mother across 2 separate sessions, running cognitive assessments and extended clinical interviews, and had told my father afterward in a private conversation that he was genuinely uncertain what he was looking at. "I've seen severe grief reactions," Dr. Reyes reportedly told my father. "I've seen early-onset psychiatric conditions that grief can sometimes accelerate or unmask. What I saw today doesn't cleanly fit either." Whitfield, and I want to be honest with you that I don't say that often. I'd like to see her again in 2 weeks, and I'd like you to keep a detailed log in the meantime of anything unusual, however small it seems. My father kept that log faithfully for the following month, a small spiral notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, and though I never read it myself until after his death, when I found it among his things, I remember as a teenager watching him write in it some evenings at the kitchen table, his handwriting careful and precise, documenting things that must have felt to him both essential and faintly absurd to be writing down at all. The specific hours my mother slept or didn't, what she ate, what she said, how long the humming lasted on any given evening, whether her eyes on that particular day seemed more like themselves or less. I want to pause here and say something important about how I've thought about all of this in the decades since, because I think it matters for understanding the rest of the story honestly. I do not discount the possibility that my mother was experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis, compounded by grief, in an era and a place with genuinely limited resources for treating it. I have read enough in the years since about how psychosis can present, about the specific cruelty of watching someone's fundamental self seem to disappear behind a conditioned medicine of that era barely understood, to hold that explanation with real respect. What I can tell you is that it does not, even now, fully account for everything that happened in our house that year, and that my father, a man who distrusted anything he couldn't put his hands on, eventually reached a point where he could no longer hold only the medical explanation either. The incident with Pastor Daniel Kowalczyk happened in May, nearly 7 months after the night at Carol Ann Pruitt's house, and it was, in many ways, the turning point that took our family's private crisis and made it something my father could no longer manage quietly within the walls of our own house. Pastor Kowalczyk had known my mother for over a decade, had officiated Roy's funeral the previous autumn, and my father, having exhausted what medicine had to offer, finally called him in desperation, describing enough of what had been happening that the pastor agreed to come to the house directly, that same evening, rather than waiting for a scheduled visit. I was sent to my room with Ellen when Pastor Kowalczyk arrived, the way children in our house were sent to their rooms whenever adults needed to have a conversation that wasn't meant for us. But our farmhouse had thin walls and a heating vent that ran directly between the kitchen below and my bedroom above. And I heard, that evening, enough of what happened downstairs to understand, even at 14, that something had occurred that none of the adults in that kitchen were fully equipped to process. I heard my mother's voice, briefly, in a register I had never heard from her before, low and strange in a way that didn't match the cadence of how she normally spoke, followed by a long silence, followed by Pastor Kowalczyk's voice, considerably shakier than I had ever heard a pastor's voice sound from the pulpit, asking my father whether he had considered contacting the diocese, a suggestion that confused me at the time because we were Lutheran, not Catholic. And it was only years later that I understood the pastor had been suggesting, as gently and as far outside his own comfort zone as he knew how, that our family might need to seek out resources considerably beyond what he personally had training to offer. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. What followed was the strangest and hardest summer of my childhood, an unbroken stretch of months during which my mother existed in our house in a way I still find difficult to fully describe, present physically but absent in some more essential way for stretches that could last hours or, occasionally, days, punctuated by brief windows, sometimes only minutes long, where something like the actual Margaret Whitfield would surface again, recognizable, terrified, aware, before receding back into whatever the rest of the time had claimed. I want to describe what it was like that summer to live inside a household so thoroughly reorganized around uncertainty, because I think the specific texture of it matters for understanding everything that followed. My father took a leave of absence from the grain elevator that he could genuinely not afford financially, but felt he had no choice but to take, unwilling to leave the three of us alone in the house with our mother for the long stretches his job would otherwise have required. Patricia, 16 that summer, quietly took on far more of the household's daily management than any 16-year-old should reasonably have had to carry, cooking most of our meals, managing Ellen's care on the days our mother was entirely absent behind her own eyes, developing, over those months, a specific, premature competence that I think shaped the rest of her adult life in ways she's only recently, as we've gotten older, begun to fully articulate to me. Ellen, only 9, bore the summer differently, retreating into a specific watchfulness that Patricia and I both noticed and worried over, spending long stretches of each day in her room with the door closed, coming out only for meals, developing, that summer, an attachment to a stuffed rabbit she'd otherwise outgrown years earlier that she carried with her constantly, a regression neither Patricia nor I ever mentioned to her directly, both of us understanding, even as teenagers, that she needed whatever comfort she could find wherever she could find it. It was during one of those brief windows of clarity, in early July, that my mother said something to me directly that I have carried, unaltered, in my memory for 46 years, because I understood, even as a 14-year-old boy standing in our kitchen doorway, that I was hearing something she needed desperately for someone to hear. She had called me into the kitchen, her voice sounding, for the first time in months, entirely like her own voice, and when I came in she was sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at me with an expression of such raw, present fear that it frightened me more than any of the strange, absent behavior of the preceding months had managed to. "Tommy," she said, using the name only she called me, "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to remember what I'm about to say because I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to say it clearly. Something came in that night at Carol Ann's. I don't fully understand what it is or why it chose me, but I can feel it, Tommy. When it's not in control, I can feel it there, waiting, the way you feel a held breath. I am still here. I want you to know that, whatever happens, whatever you see me do or hear me say in the months ahead, I am still in here, fighting it, for as long as I can manage to keep fighting. I need you to tell your father that. I don't think I'm going to have many more chances to say it clearly enough for anyone to understand." I did tell my father that same evening, word for word as close as I could manage, and I watched something in his face break in a way I had never seen before. The specific look of a man finally accepting a truth he had spent 9 months refusing to fully accept, because accepting it meant there was no longer any safe, ordinary explanation left to retreat into. What my father did next over the following weeks was reach out, quietly, methodically, beyond the resources our small town and our own denomination had to offer, eventually connecting, through a chain of increasingly uncomfortable phone calls, with a retired Catholic priest named Father Joseph Aldrich, who had, decades earlier before his retirement, been involved in a small number of cases. The DOCs had referred to him specifically because of his background and training in exactly the kind of crisis our family was living through. Father Aldrich came to our house in early August, spent the better part of 2 days with my mother, conducting an extensive series of conversations and evaluations that he was careful to explain upfront would need to rule out every ordinary psychiatric and medical explanation before he would consider anything else, out of what he called a professional and moral obligation not to mistake genuine illness for something else entirely. Father Aldrich was 71 years old that summer, a soft-spoken man with the specific patience of someone who had spent a career sitting with people in their worst moments, and I remember him treating our family, from the very first afternoon, with a kind of careful, unhurried respect that none of the previous doctors or specialists had quite managed. He spent most of that first day not with my mother directly, but with my father, Patricia, Ellen, and me, individually and together, asking detailed, methodical questions about everything that had happened since November, writing careful notes in a leather notebook he carried, occasionally asking us to describe a specific incident 2 or 3 different ways, from different angles, the way I imagine a detective might, testing our accounts for consistency, without ever making any of us feel accused of exaggerating or imagining things. It was only on the second day that he spent significant time alone with my mother, a conversation that lasted nearly 4 hours, at the end of which he came to find my father in the kitchen looking, my father told me later, more shaken than he had looked at any point during his own 2 days of careful professional evaluation. "I want to be honest with Whitfield," Father Aldrich told him. In a conversation my father recounted to me almost word for word, years later, the one time he ever fully described it. "I have seen 4 cases in my career that I ultimately came to believe were genuine. I want you to understand what a small number that is against the dozens and dozens of cases referred to me that turned out, on careful examination, to be something medicine could and did eventually treat. I do not say what I'm about to say lightly, and I want you to keep pursuing every medical avenue alongside whatever we do here, because I could be wrong, and because even if I'm right, medicine may still have a role to play in helping her body and mind recover from what's been happening to them. But I believe, Mr. Whitfield, that this is one of the 4. If you're finding this story compelling, Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I do not want to describe in this story the specific details of what Father Aldrich and my mother went through together over the following weeks, both because much of it is not fully mine to narrate secondhand, and because I think there's a meaningful difference between telling you that something happened and walking you through its mechanics as though it were a manual. What I can tell you is that Father Aldrich told my father, after those first 2 days, that he believed, cautiously, provisionally, with the specific careful hedging of a man who had seen enough genuine psychiatric crises to know how easily one could be mistaken for something else, that our family was dealing with something beyond what medicine alone was equipped to address, and that he was willing, with my mother's full and repeated consent, freely given during one of her clearer windows, to begin a process that might help her. That process took the better part of 6 weeks, conducted in careful sessions, always with my father present, always with my mother's ongoing consent reconfirmed whenever she was lucid enough to give it. And I want to be honest that I do not know, even now, decades later, with the specific clarity a documentary or a movie would give you, exactly what those 6 weeks accomplished. Because what happened at the end of them was not the clean, triumphant resolution the phrase happy. My mother had good weeks during that stretch, weeks where the woman we all remembered seemed to be present for days at a stretch, present enough that my father let himself, cautiously, begin to hope. And then, in late September, almost exactly a year after Roy's death, she had what Father Aldrich later described to my father as the worst relapse of the entire process, a stretch of nearly 4 days during which almost nothing of the woman we knew as our mother was reachable at all. It was during that 4-day stretch on the 3rd night that the fire started. I do not know, even now, exactly how it started, and I have made my peace over 4 decades with never fully knowing. The county fire investigators' report, which I did not read myself until I was well into my 30s and finally strong enough to request it, listed the cause as undetermined, likely electrical, originating in the kitchen sometime after 2 in the morning. My father, Ellen, and I got out safely, woken by the smoke alarm and by my father's own instincts, which had him moving through that house with a speed I still remember vividly, pulling both of us out through our bedroom windows onto the porch roof before the stairwell became impassable. My mother did not get out. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. I do not, to this day, know whether what happened that night was an accident, a final and complete loss of whatever battle Father Aldrich had been helping her fight, or something else entirely that I will never have language adequate to describe. What I can tell you is that the fire investigators' report noted, as an observation rather than a finding, that my mother's body was discovered not near any of the house's exits, but in the basement, in the corner farthest from the stairs, in a position the investigator described in careful, clinical language as consistent with someone who had made no apparent attempt to escape. Father Aldrich came to the funeral, stood quietly at the back of First Lutheran through a service that half our small town attended, and spoke to my father afterward, briefly, in a conversation my father only ever partially described to me. Years later, saying only that Father Aldrich had told him he believed, based on everything he'd witnessed over those 6 weeks, that my mother had been engaged in a genuine and courageous fight against something that had taken hold of her through no real fault or invitation of her own beyond a single evening of desperate grief, and that in the last days of her life, in whatever clarity she'd managed to hold on to, she had understood exactly what was happening to her, had recognized, with the specific horror of full awareness, that the thing occupying her was winning, and had, in the last conscious choice available to her, gone to the one place in that house where she believed, rightly or wrongly, that whatever happened next would not be able to reach the rest of her family sleeping upstairs. The weeks and months after the funeral were, in their own way, as difficult as anything that had come before, in a different, quieter register. Our small town, which had watched our family's crisis unfold at a distance all year, without ever quite understanding its full shape, closed around us with a specific, well-meaning grief that had no space in it for the stranger parts of what we'd actually lived through. People brought casseroles and told my father Margaret was in a better place now, and he thanked them, every time, with the specific exhausted patience of a man who understood that the fuller truth was not something this town, this decade, had any vocabulary to receive, and that protecting his children from having to explain it publicly mattered more than being fully understood by his neighbors. My father did not remarry. He raised the three of us alone on that same 11 acres for another 8 years, until Ellen left for college, and the house finally emptied out enough that he sold the grain elevator and moved into town, into a smaller place he said he needed less, because there was less to fill it with. He talked about my mother often in the years that followed, always in the register of the woman she'd been for the 41 years before that November, the Sunday school teacher, the gardener, the woman who made every child in the neighborhood feel entirely seen. He rarely spoke, even to me, about the final year, and I understood, without ever needing him to say it directly, that he had made his own private peace with keeping that year separate from the rest of his memory of her, protecting the larger, truer portrait of who she'd been from being overwritten by its ending. Patricia and Ellen, my sisters, carried the year differently than I did, in ways we've only really compared as adults, decades later, sitting together at family gatherings after our father's own death, finally willing to say out loud the things we'd each privately carried alone for so long. Patricia told me, at one of those gatherings, that she'd spent years afterward unable to fully trust her own memory of that final year, wondering whether grief and a frightened teenager's imagination had exaggerated things that had, in reality, been simply our mother's mental illness playing out in ways that a small-town family in 1980 didn't have the resources or vocabulary to properly treat. I understand that doubt. I have felt versions of it myself, at various points across 4 decades, and I don't think it's wrong to hold it, alongside everything else. Ellen, who was only 9 that year and remembers less of the specific detail than Patricia or I do, has told me that what she carries most is not any particular incident, but a kind of permanent, low-grade vigilance she developed that year and never fully lost, an instinct to watch the people she loves most closely for signs of change, a habit she spent years in therapy trying to soften into something less exhausting to live with. I do not know if that is true. I have spent 46 years turning it over, unable to fully accept it and unable to fully let it go, and I think, at 60 years old, I have finally made a kind of peace with never resolving it into a single, settled understanding. What I do know, with total certainty, unclouded by any of the strangeness of that final year, is the woman who taught Sunday school for a decade and canned tomatoes every August and made every child in our neighborhood feel entirely seen. I know that woman loved us, completely and without reservation. For the 41 years I had the fortune of knowing her as simply my mother, before whatever happened at Carol Ann Pruitt's house that November evening took hold of something in her that none of us, not my father, not Dr. Burgeon, not Pastor Kowalczyk, and perhaps not even Father Aldrich himself, fully understood in time to save her. I think, if I'm honest, that the hardest part of carrying this story for 4 decades has not been the fear of it, though there was plenty of that at 14, lying awake some nights convinced I could still hear that low, tuneless humming somewhere in the house. The hardest part has been the specific, unresolvable grief of losing my mother twice. Once slowly, over that final year, watching pieces of her recede in ways I couldn't stop or fully understand, and then again completely on that September night, before I'd ever gotten the chance to fully grieve the first loss, because I was still, in some confused 14-year-old way, hoping the second loss wouldn't actually come, hoping Father Aldrich's 6 weeks would be enough, hoping the woman who told me in that kitchen that she was still in there fighting would win. I have spent considerable time, across 4 decades, in various forms of grief counseling, and later, in ordinary therapy that touched on that year alongside everything else a person accumulates across a lifetime. And I want to be honest that none of it has ever fully resolved the specific, layered nature of what I lost that year. A grief counselor I saw in my 30s, a careful, patient woman named Dr. Elaine Foss, who specialized in what she called complicated or ambiguous loss, told me once that my experience, mourning a parent whose fundamental self seemed to disappear before her physical death arrived, carried its own particular grief architecture that standard bereavement models didn't always account for well, and that naming that specific architecture, even without ever fully resolving the underlying uncertainty about what had actually happened, had been, for many of her other clients in similar situations, its own meaningful form of healing. I found that to be true for me as well, eventually, though it took considerably longer than either of us initially expected. I visit her grave every year on the anniversary at the small cemetery behind First Lutheran where she's buried beside my father, who joined her there 11 years ago. I don't fully know what I believe, even now, about what happened to her in that final year, and I've stopped needing to resolve that uncertainty before I can still love her, still miss her, still carry forward everything she actually taught me about attention and warmth and making people feel seen. The things that were true about her for 41 years and remain true about the parts of me she shaped, regardless of how the final year ended. Carol Ann Prout lived another 31 years after that November evening, and my Aunt Dolores told me, at our father's funeral, that Carol Ann had visited my mother's grave every single year on the same anniversary I do, arriving early in the morning before anyone else, staying only a few minutes, never speaking to any other family member who happened to be there at the same time. I have always wondered what she carried in those 31 years about the evening she'd organized, the specific weight of having opened whatever door got opened that night, however unknowingly, however innocently the whole gathering had started. I never asked her directly. She passed away 4 years ago, and by then, I think, both of us had made our own separate, private peace with not needing the other's forgiveness to keep living. I didn't know, standing on that porch roof at 14 years old watching our house burn against a black Iowa sky, that Father Aldrich was going to call our family again, 11 years later, about another case in a neighboring county that he believed might be connected, in ways he was still working to understand, to whatever had originated in Carol Ann Prout's house that November. I didn't know that Carol Ann herself, in the years following my mother's death, was going to experience her own quiet, private decline that our family only learned about secondhand, decades later, through her own children. I didn't know how many more names, in the end, were going to turn out to be connected to a single grief-stricken evening in the autumn of 1979. But that's a story for next time. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. And if you're going through something difficult in your own life right now, please know you don't have to carry it alone. Reach out to someone you trust or a professional who can help. Thanks for being here. For real.